My name is Linda Parker, and the morning I woke up with 79 missed calls from my parents. I stared at my phone and laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. For a moment, I thought there had been some terrible emergency. Then I saw the messages. Linda, call us immediately. We need to talk. Family comes first. Please answer. And my personal favorite from my younger sister Melissa. Don't make this weird. Funny how nobody had worried about making things weird when they handed me a $2 lottery ticket and gave her a $13,000 cruise. Funny how people suddenly remembered I existed after learning I'd won $100 million. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The story really began on Christmas Eve. At 62 years old, I should have known better than to expect anything different. Still, some small part of me hoped. Every Christmas, my husband Tom and I drove 40 minutes from our modest ranch house in Dayton, Ohio, to my parents' home in a quiet suburb outside Cincinnati. It was the same brick house where I'd grown up. The same front porch. The same maple tree in the yard. A lot had changed over the decades, but one thing never did. Melissa was still the favorite. I arrived carrying a homemade pecan pie and a container of green bean casserole. Mom greeted me at the door. "Oh, good, you're here. Can you help in the kitchen?" Not hello, not Merry Christmas. Just straight to work. I smiled anyway. Of course. That had been my role my entire life. Melissa arrived 30 minutes later. Mom rushed outside to greet her. Dad carried in her luggage. Yes, luggage. For Christmas dinner. Melissa stepped inside wearing an expensive wool coat and carrying a designer handbag that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. There she is, Mom exclaimed. Dad hugged her. You look wonderful, sweetheart. Meanwhile, I was standing in the kitchen wearing an apron and washing dishes. Some things never change. Melissa was 58 years old, divorced twice, and somehow still treated like a princess. I was the older daughter who paid her bills, worked 40 years, raised a family, and never asked for much. Apparently, that made me invisible. Dinner itself was pleasant enough. The grandchildren talked about their jobs. Football played quietly in the living room. Everyone laughed and shared stories. For a few hours, it almost felt like a normal family gathering. Then came the gift exchange. And that's where everything changed. Mom announced she wanted Melissa to open her gift first. Naturally. Melissa tore open a large envelope. Inside was a beautifully printed travel package. At first I thought it might be a weekend getaway. Then Dad stood proudly and made the announcement. Your mother and I wanted to do something special. Melissa's eyes widened. What is this? A 14-day luxury Caribbean cruise. The room erupted. People clapped. Melissa squealed. Mom practically cried. It includes the suite upgrade, Dad said proudly. And airfare, Mom added. Melissa jumped up and hugged them. Oh my God, this is incredible. My son leaned toward me and whispered. That has to cost a fortune. I later learned it was nearly $13,000. $13,000 for one Christmas gift. I smiled politely. What else was I supposed to do? Then Mom handed me a small envelope. Very small. I opened it. Inside was a $2 scratch-off lottery ticket and a pair of thick winter socks. For a second, I thought it was a joke. Nobody laughed, because it wasn't. Melissa glanced at my gift and chuckled. Hey, maybe you'll be the lucky one. Several relatives laughed awkwardly. I forced a smile. Maybe. Dad nodded. Someone has to win eventually. I looked down at the ticket. $2. Not 10. Not 20. 2. The amount didn't hurt nearly as much as what it represented. The message was familiar. Melissa gets the cruise. Linda gets the consolation prize. The old pattern playing out one more time. As everyone admired cruise brochures and discussed tropical destinations, I quietly folded the lottery ticket and slipped it into my purse. Nobody noticed. Nobody asked if I was okay. Nobody seemed aware that after 60 years, favoritism still hurt. You never completely outgrow being your parents' child, even when your hair turns gray. A little later, my husband squeezed my hand under the table. You all right? I nodded. I will be, because I always was. That's another reason people take you for granted. When you're the strong one, everyone assumes you don't need anything. Around 9 o'clock, Tom and I said our goodbyes. Melissa was still talking excitedly about snorkeling excursions. Mom barely looked up when we left. The drive home was quiet. Christmas lights glowed across neighborhoods as snow drifted lightly from the sky. Tom kept both hands on the steering wheel. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For them." I stared out the window. "It's okay." But it wasn't. Not really. I thought about childhood birthdays, school awards, college tuition, wedding gifts. Every milestone had carried the same lesson. Melissa first, Linda second. If there was anything left. By the time we reached home, I felt emotionally exhausted. We changed into pajamas. Tom went to bed. I stayed in the kitchen with a cup of tea. The lottery ticket sat on the table. I almost threw it away. Then I remembered Melissa's joke. "Maybe you'll be the lucky one." I laughed softly. "Sure." I grabbed a coin from the junk drawer and scratched the silver coating. One number, then another, then another. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. My eyes moved back to the instructions, then back to the numbers, then back again. My heart began pounding. I checked a third time. A fourth. The tea mug slipped from my fingers and shattered on the floor. Tom rushed into the kitchen. "Linda, what happened?" I couldn't answer. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I simply stared at the tiny piece of cardboard in my shaking hand. Because either I had completely lost my mind, or the $2 lottery ticket my parents had tossed into an envelope as an afterthought had just changed my life forever. I didn't sleep that night. After Tom swept up the broken tea mug, we sat at the kitchen table until nearly 3 in the morning, staring at the lottery ticket under the bright overhead light. "Check it again," he kept saying. I did, again and again. The numbers never changed. Neither did the result. By dawn, I had verified the ticket through the official lottery website at least 20 times. Every check gave me the same answer. Winner, not a few $100s, not a few thousand. The jackpot. The kind of number that changes not only your life, but the lives of everyone around you. I remember sitting in complete silence after the final verification. Tom finally whispered, "Linda, I think we're rich." The word sounded ridiculous. Rich. People like us weren't rich. We were comfortable, careful, practical. Tom had spent 35 years repairing industrial equipment before retiring. I had worked 40 years as a school secretary. We paid our mortgage, saved for retirement, bought used cars, waited for sales. We were ordinary Americans. Now suddenly we were staring at a lottery ticket worth nearly $100 million. I felt excited, terrified, and strangely sad. Because before the sun had even risen, I already knew exactly what would happen if anyone found out. My family would never see me the same way again. The next morning, Christmas Day, we contacted the Lottery Commission. By the following week, we were sitting in a conference room with attorneys and financial advisors. Everything felt surreal. The lawyer explained trusts, tax structures, privacy options, investment protections. I struggled to absorb any of it. The numbers being discussed were larger than anything I had ever imagined. One advisor noticed my expression. "Mrs. Parker, you don't have to make every decision today." I laughed nervously. "That's good because I barely understand what day it is." Everyone smiled. But beneath the humor was genuine fear. Money doesn't simply solve problems. Sometimes it creates entirely new ones. Over the next several weeks, Tom and I built a small team of professionals. An attorney, a financial planner, a tax specialist. Every one of them gave the same advice. Tell as few people as possible. Protect your privacy. Move slowly. Think carefully. I followed that advice. At first, only 3 people knew the truth. Tom, my son Brian, and me. Brian drove over one Saturday afternoon after I called him. When I showed him the paperwork, he stared at it for nearly a full minute. Finally, he looked up. "Mom, is this real?" "Apparently." He shook his head. Then he did something I'll never forget. He hugged me. Not the money, not the ticket. Me. "I hope this makes your life easier." That was his first thought. Not what he might get, not what he might ask for. Just concern for me. I realized then how fortunate I was. Money reveals character. Brian already had plenty. Not financially. Personally, as winter turned into spring, life settled into a strange routine. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still grocery shopped at Kroger. Still drove my 7-year-old Honda. Still met friends for coffee. Still volunteered at church. But inside, everything felt different. Because I was carrying a secret worth $100 million. Sometimes I would sit quietly and think about the past. Not because of the money itself, because of what the ticket represented. I kept remembering moments from childhood. Melissa receiving a brand new car at 16. I got Dad's old station wagon after college. Melissa's wedding paid for in full. Tom and I paid for our own. When Melissa struggled financially, Mom and Dad wrote checks. When we struggled, they offered advice. I wasn't jealous anymore. At 62, jealousy seemed childish. What hurt was the message behind it. The assumption that I would always be fine, that I didn't need help, didn't need encouragement, didn't need affection. Strong children often pay a hidden price. Everyone assumes they'll carry the load forever. One afternoon in February, I found myself standing in my parents' driveway. I hadn't planned the visit. I simply wanted to see them, to understand how I felt. Mom answered the door. "Linda, what a surprise." I stepped inside. The familiar smell of coffee and cinnamon greeted me. Dad sat in his favorite recliner watching television. For a moment, they looked older than I remembered. Much older. Dad's shoulders seemed smaller. Mom moved more slowly. The sight softened something inside me. These weren't just the parents who hurt me. They were also two aging people approaching the final chapter of life. We spent an hour talking. Weather, neighbors, doctor appointments. Nothing important. Nothing emotional. And yet when I left, I felt strangely disappointed. Not once did they ask about me. Not once did they wonder whether I was happy. It wasn't cruelty. It was habit. They had spent decades assuming I needed nothing. Back home, Tom noticed my mood. "You wanted something from them." I nodded. "Maybe." "What?" I thought for a long moment. I wanted them to see me. That night, I made a decision. Regardless of the money, I would stop chasing approval that might never come. I was too old for that. Too tired. Too aware of how short life really is. Instead, I focused on the future. We established trusts, updated estate plans, created charitable giving strategies. For the first time in my life, I wasn't worrying about bills or retirement. The feeling was liberating. But secrets have a way of escaping, no matter how carefully you guard them. The Lottery Commission had procedures. Public records existed. Reporters asked questions. Rumors spread. Month after month, we maintained privacy. Then one afternoon in early summer, everything changed. I was watering flowers in the backyard when my phone rang. It was our attorney. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Linda, I wanted you to hear this from me." My stomach tightened. "Hear what?" "A local reporter has connected your name to the lottery trust." I froze. "Are you certain?" "Yes." "How long?" "Probably not long. Once the story is published, people will know." After hanging up, I sat alone on the patio. The sun was shining. Birds chirped. The world looked exactly the same. Yet I knew my life was about to become very different. The secret that had protected me for months was slipping away. And the moment my family discovered who held that winning ticket, everything I feared would finally begin. The article appeared on a Tuesday morning. I found out because my neighbor Carol called before 8 o'clock. "Linda," she said, sounding breathless, "are you sitting down?" That question is never a good sign. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. "I am now," she read the headline. "Local retired school secretary revealed as winner of historic lottery jackpot." For a moment, I just stared out the window. The secret was over. Months of privacy had disappeared with one newspaper article. "Linda, I'm here." "Oh, honey," I laughed softly. Not because anything was funny, because there wasn't much else to do. By noon, my phone had become almost unusable. Calls, texts, voicemails, emails, Facebook messages. People I hadn't spoken to in 20 years suddenly remembered my existence. Former coworkers, distant cousins, old neighbors, even a woman I vaguely remembered from high school. Everyone seemed to have the same message. "Congratulations." And underneath the congratulations was another message they didn't say out loud. "You have money now." The first call from family came shortly after lunch. "Melissa." I let it ring, then ring again, then go to voicemail. A minute later, Mom called, then Dad, then Melissa again. By dinner time, my phone looked like it was having a nervous breakdown. Tom sat beside me on the couch. "How many now?" I checked. 31. He shook his head. Good grief. The next morning, it climbed past 50. By lunchtime, 63. When I finally looked after dinner, the number had reached 79 missed calls. 79. I remember staring at that number. Not one. Not two. 79. In all the years since I'd moved away from home, I don't think my parents had called me 79 times combined. Now they couldn't stop. Melissa eventually sent a text. Call me. Another followed immediately. Why are you ignoring family? Then, we need to talk. I stared at the screen. The words bothered me for a reason I couldn't immediately identify. Then I realized it. Nobody had asked how I felt. Nobody had asked if my life had become overwhelming. Nobody had asked whether I needed space. They needed to talk. Not me. Them. The following afternoon, I finally answered a call from Mom. The moment I said hello, she burst into tears. Oh, Linda, why haven't you answered? I closed my eyes. Because I knew exactly where this conversation was heading. I've been busy. Busy. She sounded almost offended. You won $100 million. There it was. Not hello. Not how are you. Straight to the money. Dad came onto the line next. We've been worried. That nearly made me laugh. Worried. For months, they barely called. Now they were worried. I'm fine. Why didn't you tell us? Mom asked. I thought about that question carefully. There were dozens of truthful answers. Instead, I chose the simplest. I needed time. A long silence followed. Then Dad cleared his throat. Well, family should know these things. Family. Interesting word. Especially from people who had spent decades treating one daughter like royalty and the other like an afterthought. The call ended politely enough, but something fundamental had changed. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one seeking approval. They were seeking access. The difference was impossible to ignore. Over the next week, the requests began arriving. At first, they were subtle. A cousin mentioned medical bills. An uncle discussed retirement concerns. A niece talked about student loans. Every conversation somehow wandered toward money. One cousin actually sent a spreadsheet. A spreadsheet listing financial challenges that could supposedly be solved with my help. Tom nearly choked laughing when I showed it to him. You've become an ATM with a pulse. I noticed. The hardest conversation came with Melissa. She called one evening while I was making dinner. Against my better judgment, I answered. Finally. Not hello. Just finally. I stirred a pot of soup. Hi, Melissa. I've been trying to reach you. I know. She sighed dramatically. I don't understand why you're acting this way. There it was again. As though I had done something wrong. What way? Distant. I almost dropped the spoon. Distant. The woman who called me twice a year was accusing me of being distant. Melissa, I've been adjusting to a lot. I get that. Her tone suggested she didn't. Then came the sentence I'd been expecting. You know blessings should be shared. I smiled despite myself. There it was. The real reason for the call. Not concern. Not sisterly affection. Not curiosity. Money. I already share plenty. That's not what I mean. Of course it wasn't. She wanted specifics. Numbers. Checks. Promises. I changed the subject. She changed it back. Eventually, she became frustrated. Before hanging up, she said something that stayed with me. We're family, Linda. As though the word family automatically entitled someone to my resources. The strange thing was that I genuinely loved my family. Even Melissa. Even my parents. Love wasn't the problem. The problem was entitlement. The assumption that my good fortune belonged to everyone. A few days later, Brian came over for dinner. Afterward, we sat on the back patio watching the sunset. I told him about the calls, the requests, the pressure. He listened quietly. Then he asked a question nobody else had asked. Mom, what do you want? I blinked. What? What do you actually want to do with the money? The simplicity of the question stunned me. Because everyone else focused on what they wanted. Brian focused on me. I thought for a moment. I want security. He nodded. What else? I want to help people. Good. But not people who think they're entitled to it. He smiled. That sounds reasonable. The conversation stayed with me. Because the truth was becoming increasingly clear. Winning the lottery hadn't changed my family. It had revealed them. The generous people became more generous. The grateful people became more grateful. and the entitled people became impossible to miss. 2 weeks after the article appeared, Dad called again. This time his voice sounded unusually formal. Your mother and I would like everyone to get together. My stomach tightened. What kind of get-together? A family meeting. There was a pause. Then he added words that instantly raised every alarm bell in my head. There are some important matters we need to discuss. I looked across the room at Tom. He could tell from my expression that something was wrong. What matters? I asked. Dad hesitated. We'd rather discuss them in person. That answer told me everything. Whatever this meeting was about, it wasn't really a family reunion. It was about the money. And somehow I already knew exactly how it would end. I spent the next 3 days debating whether I should attend the family meeting. Every instinct told me it was a bad idea. Every experience from the previous 2 months told me exactly what was waiting for me. Yet part of me still hoped I was wrong. Maybe my parents genuinely wanted to reconnect. Maybe Melissa wanted to repair our relationship. Maybe everyone simply needed time to adjust. Tom didn't look convinced. We were eating breakfast when I told him the meeting had been scheduled. When? Saturday. He buttered a piece of toast and gave me a look I'd seen many times during our 40 years of marriage. The look that said he already knew the answer but wanted me to say it myself. What do you think they're going to talk about? I laughed. We both know. Yeah. Neither of us said the word money. We didn't have to. Saturday arrived hot and humid. The meeting wasn't being held at my parents' house. That should have been my first clue. Instead, Dad had reserved a private conference room at a restaurant just outside Cincinnati. A conference room for a family gathering. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw 6 vehicles already parked outside. Tom glanced through the windshield. Looks official, I noticed. The moment we entered the room, I understood exactly what was happening. Everyone was there. Mom, Dad, Melissa, several cousins, an aunt, an uncle, even a nephew I hadn't seen in almost 4 years. They all greeted me warmly, too warmly. The atmosphere felt forced. Like everyone was pretending this was a normal family event. But nobody schedules a conference room for a normal family event. Dad stood and cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. I nearly smiled. It sounded like the opening of a board meeting, not a family conversation. We sat down around a long table, coffee cups, notepads, bottled water. The setup somehow made everything worse. Then Dad reached into a folder. A folder. My stomach sank. He actually had paperwork. Linda, he began, we've spent some time discussing ways our family can move forward together. Move forward together. Interesting phrase. I remained silent. Dad removed several sheets of paper. Mom nodded encouragingly. Melissa folded her arms and smiled. The smile bothered me. It looked less like affection and more like expectation. Dad began reading. At first, I honestly thought I was misunderstanding him. Then I realized I wasn't. The document contained a list of financial needs, requests, suggestions, opportunities, whatever polite name they wanted to use. The meaning was obvious. Money. My money. One cousin needed help paying off a mortgage. Another wanted assistance with retirement. An uncle hoped to expand a small business. Someone needed a new roof. Someone else wanted help buying a house. The requests kept coming, one after another, page after page. I sat quietly while they talked. Nobody seemed embarrassed. Nobody seemed uncomfortable. The strangest part was how normal they acted. As if this conversation made perfect sense. As if gathering to discuss the distribution of someone else's money was a reasonable family activity. Then Melissa finally spoke. She leaned forward. There's one thing I'd really like to discuss. Of course there was. Dad nodded. Go ahead. Melissa smiled. I found a beautiful lake property. Tom lowered his eyes. I knew he was trying not to laugh. A lake property? I asked. Yes. She pulled out photographs. Actual photographs. She had prepared a presentation. I wasn't sure whether to be impressed or horrified. It would be perfect for family vacations. Family vacations. Interesting. Considering nobody had invited me to several family trips over the years. Melissa slid the photos toward me. The house costs around $900,000. I stared at her. She stared back, apparently waiting for my reaction. Finally, I asked, and it would benefit everyone. There it was. The assumption, the expectation, the certainty, not a request, a conclusion. The room grew quiet. I looked around the table. Nobody seemed surprised by what she'd said. That told me everything. They had discussed this beforehand, extensively. Then my aunt spoke. If we're being honest, Linda, you've received an extraordinary blessing. I nodded. That's true. And blessings are meant to help others. There was enough guilt packed into that sentence to sink a battleship. I folded my hands. Are any of you asking how I'm doing? Silence. The question landed harder than I expected. Nobody answered. Because nobody had. Not once. Not during the calls. Not during the texts. Not during this meeting. The money had become the entire conversation. I took a slow breath, then another. Years of frustration began rising to the surface. Not anger. Something deeper. Pain. The kind that accumulates quietly over decades. Can I ask everyone a question? Dad nodded cautiously. Of course. I looked directly at Melissa, then Mom, then Dad. If I hadn't won the lottery, would we be sitting in this room right now? Nobody spoke. The silence was immediate and devastating. I waited. Still nothing. A cousin looked down at the table. My aunt adjusted her glasses. Melissa crossed her arms. Dad cleared his throat. But no answer came, because there wasn't one. The truth sat in the center of the room like an unwelcome guest. If I had remained the same retired school secretary living in Dayton, this meeting would never have existed. Nobody would have rented a conference room. Nobody would have prepared lists. Nobody would have discussed lake houses. I stood slowly. That's what I thought. Mom looked upset. Linda, that's not fair. I turned toward her. No. Her expression softened. For a brief moment, I thought she might finally understand. Then she said something that broke my heart. We just want what's best for the family. Not for me. For the family. The distinction mattered, because somehow I was still being treated as a resource rather than a daughter. I looked at my parents. The people I'd spent years trying to please. Years trying to impress. Years trying to earn equal treatment from. And suddenly I felt tired. Not angry. Just tired. I'm going home. Melissa stood. So that's it. I nodded. That's it. You have all that money and you're just walking away. The room became very still. I looked at her carefully. You know what's interesting? What? Nobody here has apologized. Confusion crossed several faces. I continued. Nobody has acknowledged the favoritism. Nobody has acknowledged the hurt. Nobody has asked what this experience has been like for me. I paused. Everyone just showed up with requests. Nobody argued, because nobody could. Tom stood beside me. Together we walked toward the door. Behind us, conversations erupted. Voices overlapped. Explanations. Complaints. Excuses. I didn't stop. For the first time in my life, I wasn't staying to defend myself. Outside, the summer air felt strangely refreshing. We climbed into the car. Tom started the engine. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, he reached over and squeezed my hand. You okay? I looked out the window. Actually, for the first time in weeks, I meant it. Yeah, but life has a way of changing direction when you least expect it. Because 3 days after that meeting, my phone rang again. And this time, the news had nothing to do with money. My father had collapsed. 3 days after the family meeting, I was watering tomatoes in my backyard when Melissa called. For a second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then I answered. Her voice sounded different. No irritation. No attitude. No demands. Just fear. Linda. My stomach tightened immediately. What's wrong? It's Dad. Everything inside me went cold. What happened? He collapsed. The watering hose slipped from my hand. Water sprayed across the lawn as I stood frozen. Is he alive? Yes. They're taking him to Mercy Hospital. I didn't ask another question. I dropped everything and told Tom. Within 15 minutes, we were driving south toward Cincinnati. The entire trip felt unreal. Only days earlier, I'd walked out of that conference room furious and disappointed. Now none of that seemed important. Money, arguments, resentment. Suddenly, they all looked very small. Because no matter how complicated our relationship had become, he was still my father. The man who taught me to ride a bicycle. The man who attended my high school graduation. The man who worked long hours to keep food on our table. Human beings are complicated. People can hurt you deeply and still hold a place in your heart. When we arrived at the hospital, Mom looked exhausted. She was sitting alone in the waiting area. The moment she saw me, she stood. For a second, I thought she might apologize for everything that had happened. Instead, she simply wrapped her arms around me. And surprisingly, I hugged her back. "How is he?" "They think it was his heart." I nodded. The fear in her eyes was real. Not about money. Not about family politics. Just fear. For several hours, all of us sat together waiting for updates. Melissa, Mom, me. The atmosphere felt completely different from the conference room. Nobody mentioned money once. Nobody discussed requests. Nobody brought up the lottery. We were just a family worried about someone we loved. Late that evening, a cardiologist finally spoke with us. Dad had suffered a moderate heart attack. Fortunately, he had reached the hospital quickly. His prognosis was good. Relief washed over the room. Mom actually cried. Melissa cried. And to my surprise, so did I. Because no matter what conflicts existed between us, I wasn't ready to lose my father. The next morning, I visited him alone. He looked smaller in the hospital bed. Older. The confident man who had organized family meetings and financial discussions suddenly appeared fragile. When he saw me, he smiled weakly. "Hey, kid." Kid. I hadn't heard him call me that in years. "Hey, yourself." For several minutes, we talked about ordinary things. The nurses. The food. The weather. Neither of us mentioned the meeting. Eventually, Dad looked out the window. "I scared everyone." "You did." He nodded slowly. "I scared myself too." The honesty caught me off guard. Then he said something unexpected. "Getting old isn't for cowards." I laughed. "No, it isn't." We sat quietly. Machines beeped softly nearby. Finally, he turned toward me. "I know you're angry." The words hung in the air. Part of me wanted to unload decades of frustration. Another part saw an 83-year-old man recovering from a heart attack. I chose my words carefully. "I'm hurt." He nodded. "I know." For once, he didn't argue, didn't defend himself, didn't explain, just listened. After leaving the hospital, I found myself thinking differently. Not about forgiveness, not yet, but about time. At 62, I understood something I hadn't appreciated when I was younger. Life doesn't last forever. One day, there are endless opportunities to have difficult conversations. Then suddenly there aren't. That realization changed something inside me. Not everything, but something. Over the following weeks, I became heavily involved in helping coordinate Dad's recovery. Doctor appointments, medication schedules, home modifications, insurance paperwork. Mom struggled with the logistics. Melissa tried to help but wasn't particularly organized. So naturally, I stepped in. The old reliable daughter. The difference this time was that I chose to do it. Not because I wanted approval. Not because I expected gratitude. Because it was the right thing to do. One afternoon, Tom noticed me sorting medical paperwork at the dining room table. "You know," he said, "most people would understand if you stepped back." "I know." "After everything." I nodded. Then I looked at the stack of documents. My revenge already happened. He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" I thought about it. The answer surprised even me. "Walking away from that meeting." He waited. I continued. "I didn't scream. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't write giant checks to prove a point." I smiled slightly. "I simply refused to be treated like an ATM." Tom grinned. "That's true." The more I considered it, the more I realized something important. Real revenge wasn't making people suffer. It was refusing to participate in unhealthy patterns anymore. That realization shaped the next major decision of my life. Several months after Dad's heart attack, my financial advisors arranged a series of meetings regarding charitable giving. At first, I considered making anonymous donations. Then I changed my mind. If I was going to use this money, I wanted it to matter. I established a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in education. Teachers had shaped my life. I wanted to honor that. Next came a Veterans Assistance Program. Then grants for senior citizens struggling with medical expenses. Then support for local food banks. The projects expanded quickly. Everywhere I went, I met grateful people, hardworking people. People trying their best under difficult circumstances. Unlike the conversations I'd experienced after winning the lottery, these interactions felt genuine. No entitlement. No assumptions. Just gratitude. A local newspaper eventually published a story about the scholarship fund. The response surprised me. Letters arrived from students, parents, veterans, retirees, people I had never met. One letter came from an 80-year-old widow whose medication costs had been covered through a community program we helped fund. I cried while reading it. Because for the first time since winning the lottery, the money felt meaningful, not like a burden, not like a source of conflict. A tool, a blessing, something capable of improving lives. Not everyone shared my enthusiasm. Melissa certainly didn't. One evening, she called sounding frustrated. I don't understand. Understand what? Why you're giving so much away. I smiled. Because I can. But strangers are benefiting. There it was. The comparison. The resentment. I answered carefully. People who need help are benefiting. She didn't respond. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly asked a question. One that surprised me. Do you think Mom and Dad are disappointed in me? I sat upright. This wasn't the Melissa I knew. This sounded vulnerable, uncertain, human. I think they're disappointed in some choices. Another silence. Then she whispered, maybe I am too. After we hung up, I sat alone on the porch for a long time. People can change, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, but only when they're willing to face uncomfortable truths. A week later, Mom called. Her voice sounded unusually serious. Linda, can we meet? Sure. Just the two of us. I sensed immediately that this wasn't about Dad's health, or money, or family logistics. There was something else, something she'd been carrying for a very long time. And somehow, I knew the conversation waiting ahead might change everything. The following Saturday, I met my mother at a small cafe halfway between Dayton and Cincinnati. It was the kind of place retirees loved. Quiet music, homemade pies displayed behind glass, waitresses who called everyone Hun. Mom was already seated when I arrived. For a moment, I simply stood there watching her. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. Age has a way of stripping away the confidence people wear for decades. At 80 years old, she no longer looked like the woman who had always seemed certain about everything. She looked tired, human, vulnerable. When I sat down, she smiled weakly. Thank you for coming. Of course. A waitress brought coffee. Neither of us touched it. The silence stretched between us. Not awkward, heavy. Like both of us knew this conversation had been waiting years to happen. Finally, Mom took a deep breath. I owe you an apology. Just hearing the words stunned me. Not because I hadn't imagined them, because I had stopped expecting them. Years earlier, maybe decades earlier. I said nothing. She continued. I should have said this a long time ago. Tears gathered in her eyes. I wasn't fair to you. For a moment, the entire cafe seemed to disappear. No sounds, no conversations. Just those 5 words. I wasn't fair to you. Words I'd spent most of my life hoping to hear. Words I'd eventually convinced myself would never come. My throat tightened. Mom looked down at her hands. I know you've been hurt. I nodded slowly. Yes, she swallowed. I know why. Another silence followed. Then she began telling me something I'd never heard before. Something she had apparently carried for decades. When you were growing up, you were always so responsible. I almost laughed. That explanation sounded familiar. I'd heard versions of it my entire life. But she wasn't finished. You handled things. She wiped her eyes. You solved problems. I listened. You got good grades. You worked hard. You never demanded attention. She looked directly at me. And we made a terrible mistake. The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. What mistake? Mom's eyes filled with tears again. We assumed you'd always be okay. I stared at her. Because suddenly I understood. Not agreed. Not forgiven. Understood. We worried about Melissa. She nodded. Constantly. Melissa had always struggled. Bad decisions. Financial mistakes. Impulsive relationships. Emotional ups and downs. The family often revolved around whatever crisis she happened to be experiencing. Mom continued. Every time Melissa fell apart, we rushed to help. I nodded. I remembered. Everyone remembered. And every time you succeeded, we simply expected it. That hurt because it was true. Not cruelly true. Honestly true. Mom reached across the table. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I allowed her to take my hand. We didn't appreciate what that was doing to you. I looked away. A lifetime of memories surfaced all at once. Birthdays, graduations, holidays, achievements that received polite smiles while Melissa's smallest victories received celebrations. The tears arrived before I realized they were coming. I needed parents too. The words slipped out quietly, but they carried 60 years of emotion. Mom broke completely. She began crying openly. So did you. I nodded. Yes, I know. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. We simply sat there crying. Two women carrying decades of misunderstandings. Eventually, Mom composed herself. I loved you. The statement surprised me, not because I doubted it, because I suddenly realized something important. Love and fairness aren't the same thing. People can genuinely love someone and still hurt them, sometimes deeply. I know you loved me. She looked relieved. Then why does it hurt so much? I smiled sadly. Because love isn't always enough. The truth settled between us. Not accusatory, not angry, just honest. For the first time in my life, I felt like my mother truly heard me. Not as the dependable daughter, not as the successful daughter, not as the lottery winner, simply as her child. We talked for nearly 3 hours. About everything. The past, the present, mistakes, regrets, missed opportunities. Nothing was solved instantly. Life doesn't work that way. But walls began coming down, and once they started, they didn't stop. A few days later, Dad asked if he could join us for dinner. The three of us met at my house. After dessert, he cleared his throat, the same way he always had before discussing something uncomfortable. I owe you an apology, too. I waited. He looked directly at me. I thought being tough on you was a compliment. That surprised me. What do you mean? You were capable. He shrugged. You handled things. I almost laughed. The same explanation. Different parent. We trusted you. Dad sighed. Too much. The regret in his voice felt genuine, not polished, not rehearsed. Real. I should have shown you how proud I was. The words hit me harder than I expected. Because underneath all the anger and disappointment, there had always been a little girl who wanted her father's approval. Even at 62, some needs never completely disappear. Dad continued. You deserved better? I nodded. The room remained quiet. Then something unexpected happened. Melissa spoke. She had been listening silently from across the table. Now she looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Can I say something? Everyone turned toward her. She took a deep breath. I didn't see it. Nobody answered. I knew Mom and Dad helped me more. She looked down. But I never realized what that looked like from your side. For perhaps the first time in her life, Melissa wasn't defending herself. She was reflecting. I got used to being rescued. The honesty shocked all of us. Especially me. She laughed nervously. Honestly, I probably expected it. I appreciated that more than she realized. Because accountability changes people. Not overnight, but gradually. One truth at a time. Over the following months, our family changed in ways I never expected. Not perfectly. Families are never perfect. Old habits still appeared occasionally. Old wounds still ached. But something fundamental had shifted. We were finally being honest. And honesty has a way of creating space for healing. Then one evening, while sitting on the back porch with Tom, I found myself thinking about the future. The money, the family, the responsibilities that came with both. For nearly a year I had been reacting, managing, responding. Now it was time to make a choice. Not about forgiveness. I'd already begun that process. About legacy. What role should money play in our family's future? Should it divide us, rescue us, control us, or teach us something better? As the sun disappeared beyond the trees, I finally realized the answer. And once I did, everything became clear. A year after winning the lottery, I found myself standing in front of the same Christmas tree where everything had begun. The same living room, the same brick house, the same family. And yet somehow everything felt different. The tree glowed softly in the corner. Christmas music played in the background. Snow drifted past the windows. For the first time in many years, I wasn't arriving with a knot in my stomach. I wasn't wondering whether Melissa would receive special treatment. I wasn't preparing myself for disappointment. I was simply there, present, at peace. The journey to that moment hadn't been easy. Healing never is. Over the previous 12 months, our family had worked through conversations that should have happened decades earlier. Some discussions were painful. Some ended in tears. Some ended in uncomfortable silence. But every one of them moved us forward. Not because we became perfect, because we became honest. That made all the difference. Several months earlier, I had finalized the decision that would shape our family's future. Not just financially, emotionally. I invited Mom, Dad, Melissa, Brian, and Tom to a meeting. This time, it wasn't held in a restaurant conference room. It took place in my home, around my dining room table. No folders full of demands. No presentations. No lists. Just family. When everyone arrived, I explained my plan. The room became very quiet. For nearly a year, people had speculated about what I might do with the money. Some expected large gifts, others expected dramatic gestures. The reality surprised everyone, including Melissa. I had created a structured family trust, not a blank check, not unlimited access, a trust designed to provide support while encouraging responsibility. Healthcare assistance for my parents, long-term care protections if they ever needed them, educational opportunities for future grandchildren, emergency support under clearly defined circumstances, financial counseling requirements for anyone requesting assistance, accountability, boundaries, responsibility. In other words, exactly the things money alone cannot provide. When I finished explaining it, nobody spoke for several moments. Then Dad smiled. A genuine smile. "I think that's smart." I laughed. "That's the nicest thing you've ever said about one of my financial decisions." Everyone laughed. Even Mom. Especially Mom. Melissa remained quiet longer than anyone else. Finally, she looked at me. "I thought you'd just write checks." "A lot of people thought that." She nodded. "Honestly, I probably did too." Then she surprised me. Again. "But this is better." I stared at her. "Really?" She smiled. "Yeah." She shrugged. "Maybe it's time I learn how to stand on my own." The old Melissa would never have said those words. Not in a million years. Growth doesn't happen overnight. But it does happen. One decision at a time. One honest conversation at a time. One difficult truth at a time. Over the following year, Melissa made changes I never expected. She met regularly with a financial advisor, reduced debt, created a budget, stopped relying on rescue plans whenever life became difficult. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was steady. And because it was steady, it lasted. Meanwhile, Mom and Dad seemed lighter. Perhaps because guilt no longer hovered over every interaction. Perhaps because honesty had finally entered the room. Dad's health stabilized. Mom became more relaxed. For the first time, I could remember our conversations weren't centered on Melissa's latest crisis. We talked about books, travel, grandchildren, memories, normal things, healthy things, things families should discuss. As for the money itself, it continued doing far more good than I ever imagined. The scholarship program expanded beyond our county. Veterans received assistance. Senior citizens received help with medication and housing expenses. Community organizations grew stronger. Every month, I received letters from people whose lives had improved. Some stories broke my heart. Others filled me with hope. All of them reminded me that wealth carries responsibility. Not because anyone is entitled to it, because it creates opportunities to make a difference. One afternoon, I visited a scholarship ceremony. A young woman approached me afterward. She was the first person in her family to attend college. Tears filled her eyes as she thanked me. Then she said something I'll never forget. "You changed my future." Driving home that evening, I thought about the $2 lottery ticket. The little piece of cardboard that started everything. At the time, I had viewed it as another example of favoritism. Another reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. And perhaps it was. But life has a strange sense of humor. The smallest gift became the largest blessing. Not because of the money, because of what followed. The lottery exposed truths that had been hidden for decades. It revealed entitlement, resentment, regret. But it also revealed courage, growth, forgiveness, and love. Real love. The kind willing to acknowledge mistakes. The kind willing to change. The kind willing to rebuild. Back in the present, Christmas dinner was nearly ready. Family members moved through the house carrying dishes and desserts. Laughter echoed from the kitchen. Someone turned the music up slightly. Then something happened that nearly brought tears to my eyes. Mom handed out gifts. When she reached Melissa, she smiled. Then she reached me. And smiled exactly the same way. No difference. No hierarchy. No favorite. Just love. Simple. Equal. Long overdue. Melissa opened her gift. I opened mine. Neither one of us received anything extravagant. And for the first time, neither one of us cared. Because the greatest gift wasn't under the tree, it was sitting around it. A family finally learning how to treat one another with respect. Later that evening, after everyone left, I stood alone by the window watching snow fall across the quiet street. Tom wrapped an arm around my shoulders. You happy? I thought about the question. About the money. About the pain. About the forgiveness. About the long road that brought us here. Then I smiled. Yes, and I meant it. Winning $100 million changed my life. But not in the way people imagine. The money provided security, opportunity, freedom. But the real gift was clarity. It showed me who people were, including myself. And in the end, I learned something far more valuable than how to manage wealth. I learned that money doesn't create character. It reveals it. Favoritism can wound a family for decades. Entitlement can destroy relationships. But honesty, accountability, and forgiveness can begin healing even the oldest wounds. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't getting revenge. It's refusing to become bitter. It's choosing wisdom over resentment, grace over anger, growth over pride. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to think about the people in your own life. Are there conversations you've been postponing? Hurts that need healing? Relationships worth rebuilding while there's still time? If so, don't wait. Life moves faster than we think. And if you've enjoyed this journey, feel free to share it with someone who might need the reminder that families can heal. Mistakes can be acknowledged, and it's never too late to choose a better path. Thank you for listening.